Adiz Okri was the kind of woman whose alarm rang before the sun finished stretching. Morning met her already dressed, already composed, already prepared to wrestle another day into submission. Her life moved in schedules and spreadsheets, not chaos and noise. She earned well, so well that even the walls of her office seemed to stand straighter when she walked in. Colleagues respected her competence, juniors admired her calm, and clients trusted her silence more than loud promises. If success had a scent, it would have been the faint mix of coffee and confidence that followed Adiz everywhere. She carried responsibilities the way some women carried handbags, effortlessly, without complaint, and with quiet pride. At home, Adiz was not just a wife, she was the foundation. The rent, the cars, the vacations, the invisible safety net that made life soft. She paid for all of it without keeping score. She never announced it. She never reminded anyone. To her, marriage was partnership, not a ledger. There was even a certain humor in how she moved through life, carrying weight that should have been her spine, but never did. Friends joked that if the economy collapsed, Adiz would simply adjust her budget and keep walking. She laughed with them, unaware that her generosity was being mistaken for permanence. Nelson, her husband, benefited from this stability the way a man enjoys constant electricity without remembering the generator outside. He enjoyed the comfort, the lifestyle, the ease, but rarely acknowledged the source. Adiz never saw herself as superior. She saw herself as responsible. She believed love didn't require applause. If marriage was a stage, she was content to work behind the curtain, pulling strings quietly, trusting that loyalty would be returned without needing reminders. Nelson once had ambition. That was the story he told himself whenever guilt tapped lightly on his conscience. He had lost jobs, first one, then another, each loss dressed up as temporary setbacks. At first, Adiz encouraged him. Then she supported him. Then she carried him. Somewhere between the third unpaid bill and the fifth unexplained expense, Nelson stopped looking for work with urgency and started enjoying the shelter her success provided. He still dressed well, still spoke confidently, still introduced himself with titles that no longer applied. Pride, after all, is cheaper than honesty. There was a strange comedy in how Nelson lived. He spent Adiz's money loudly while contributing silence. He spoke about our assets and our investments with the ease of a man who signed nothing but enjoyed everything. He told friends he was consulting and exploring options, phrases flexible enough to mean nothing and sound important. At social gatherings, he let people assume he was the provider. Adiz never corrected them. She believed correcting lies wasn't her responsibility if she wasn't the one telling them. What Nelson never realized was that dependence slowly rots respect. He resented Adiz quietly, not because she failed him, but because her success reminded him of his stagnation. Instead of gratitude, entitlement grew. Instead of humility, arrogance found new roots. And in that fertile ground of ego and idleness, temptation didn't need to knock loudly. It only needed to whisper. Adiz trusted the way old houses trust their foundations, without checking daily if the pillars were still standing. She never searched phones, never tracked movements, never interrogated lateness. To her, faithfulness was basic, like breathing. You didn't applaud someone for breathing. You only noticed when they stopped. If Nelson said he was out, she believed him. If he said he was tired, she adjusted her expectations. Love, in her mind, thrived on respect, not surveillance. There was a gentle humor in how oblivious Adiz was to deception, not because she was foolish, but because she believed life was already complicated enough. She didn't imagine betrayal, because she never modeled it. Her world operated on mutual trust, clear rules, and quiet accountability. Friends sometimes joked that she was too soft for a woman with so much power. Adiz smiled and replied that peace was not softness, it was a choice. This absence of suspicion made Nelson's lies easier and heavier. Every unchallenged excuse emboldened him. Every unquestioned withdrawal gave him confidence. Adiz's trust became the very thing he hid behind, mistaking grace for blindness. He never imagined that trust, once broken, would not beg, it would simply close doors. Long before love became routine, Adiz insisted on clarity. The prenup wasn't born from fear, it was born from wisdom. She believed marriage worked best when expectations were spoken aloud. The agreement was simple, almost poetic in its fairness. Whoever cheats leaves immediately and forfeits access to the lifestyle built together. No drama. No negotiations. No selective memory. Nelson signed it easily, laughing even, joking that it was unnecessary because he would never mess up. At the time, Nelson found the document amusing, like an umbrella carried on a sunny day. He never imagined rain. He never imagined himself as the man who would test that clause. The prenup was filed away, forgotten, buried under years of comfort and complacency. Adiz didn't revisit it because she didn't expect to need it. To her, trust wasn't conditional. The prenup was insurance, not a threat. What neither of them said aloud, but what life was quietly preparing, was that rules don't lose relevance just because someone forgets them. The ink on that paper did not fade with time. It waited, patient, silent, certain. They had been best friends long before Nelson arrived, sharing clothes, secrets, heartbreaks, and the kind of laughter that only women who have survived disappointment together can laugh. They knew each other's weaknesses, their ambitions, their fears of growing older without stability. When Nelson appeared in their separate lives, it felt almost coincidental at first, like one of those strange life jokes no one notices until the punchline arrives late. To each woman, he presented himself carefully, soft-spoken about his struggles, generous with spending, wounded just enough to invite sympathy. He spoke of setbacks, not failures, of transitions, not unemployment. He carried himself like a man temporarily paused, not a man completely dependent on another woman's labor. Time, careless and revealing, eventually betrayed him. A shared name mentioned too casually. A social media photo posted too confidently. A story that didn't align when retold. When the two women finally compared notes, truth unfolded slowly, painfully, like fabric tearing under tension. Nelson was married, not separated, not in the process of leaving, married. And worse, his lifestyle, the dinners, the gifts, the confidence, was funded entirely by his wife. Shock sat with them first, heavy and uncomfortable. Disgust followed. They talked about leaving. They talked about confronting him. They talked about dignity. But talk, when mixed with fear, often bends toward self-interest. What changed everything was not anger, it was calculation. If his wife was the source of the wealth, then Nelson himself was not the prize. Access was. Walking away suddenly felt like defeat. Pride resisted retreat. In whispered conversations and late-night rationalizations, a dangerous idea formed. Pregnancy would make them undeniable. Pregnancy would force responsibility. Pregnancy would secure a future. They convinced themselves they were not villains, only women refusing to lose. In that moment, friendship turned into conspiracy, and choice hardened into commitment. They stayed, not knowing they had already chosen the wrong battleground. Bad decisions rarely announce themselves as disasters. They usually arrive dressed as conversations, seated politely between cups of lukewarm drinks and shared frustrations. The two women did not wake up planning to destroy anything. They woke up afraid of losing, afraid of being the ones who always walked away empty-handed, afraid of becoming stories people whispered about with pity. In those quiet hours, when honesty feels inconvenient, they talked themselves into believing they were only correcting an imbalance. Nelson had lied. His wife had money. Life, they reasoned, was unfair already. Why should they be the only ones to leave with nothing? That was how conscience slowly loosened its grip, not through cruelty, but through rationalization. They spoke about dignity, but what they really feared was irrelevance. Walking away meant returning to uncertainty, to struggle, to the quiet embarrassment of starting again. Staying meant possibility, however twisted. They told each other that men like Nelson never truly chose. They were forced by circumstances. If circumstances could be engineered, then choice could be stolen back. Pregnancy stopped being a sacred idea and became a strategy, a pause button on rejection, a guarantee that could not be ignored. And in agreeing to this, the friendship itself shifted from comfort to conspiracy. They stopped asking, "Should we?" and started asking, "How soon?" Nelson, unaware of how far things had traveled without him, continued to live inside borrowed ease. He laughed easily, promised casually, spent confidently. He still believed himself in control, believing that affection could be managed and consequences postponed. He did not see the tightening circle. He did not realize the women were no longer reacting to him. They were planning around him. And men like Nelson often mistake silence for consent until silence becomes evidence. Nelson's days blurred into comfort funded by another person's discipline. He woke without urgency, dressed without restraint, and moved through life with the confidence of a man whose bills were ghosts, unseen and unfelt. Adi's money flowed quietly, efficiently, like oxygen. It paid for convenience, for reassurance, for the illusion of relevance Nelson clung to desperately. He spoke about our plans, while contributing none. He discussed investments he didn't understand, future ventures he never researched, and opportunities that existed only in conversation. There was something almost humorous in how committed he was to appearing important while relying entirely on someone else's labor. When the pregnancies became undeniable, panic entered his body before words could catch up. Fear made him reckless. Promises grew louder. Assurances became elaborate. He told each woman exactly what she needed to hear, carefully avoiding timelines, figures, or commitments that could trap him. He believed money could be stretched infinitely if lies were creative enough. What he didn't understand was that pregnancy does not negotiate with imagination. It demands structure, presence, and accountability. Three things Nelson had already outsourced to Adiz without her consent. At home, Adiz noticed nothing unusual. Her world was stable, orderly, predictable. She interpreted Nelson's irritability as frustration with unemployment, not guilt. She interpreted his distractions as insecurity, not deception. She believed trust was the reward for years of shared effort. And in that belief, she unknowingly gave Nelson the most dangerous gift of all, time. Time to dig deeper. Time to entangle more lives. Time to believe he could still escape a reckoning that was already circling him. Truth did not arrive screaming, nor did it knock politely. It slipped into Adiz's life the way small cracks slip into glass, quietly, invisibly at first, until the fracture becomes impossible to ignore. It began with something so ordinary it almost felt insulting, a routine financial alert that did not match any pattern she recognized. Adiz was not a suspicious woman, but she was a precise one. Numbers spoke to her more honestly than people ever did. She traced the transaction slowly, methodically, the way a surgeon studies a scan before making the first cut. What she found did not accuse, it confirmed. Repeated transfers. Familiar names. Dates that aligned too neatly with Nelson's unexplained absences. Her chest tightened, not from panic, but from clarity. This was not doubt. This was evidence standing calmly in the open. She did not cry immediately. Instead, she experienced something colder and more devastating than tears. Revision. Every memory rearranged itself without permission. Every expense rewrote its story. The dinners she funded while working late. The confidence Nelson wore so comfortably. The ease with which he spoke of future plans while contributing nothing but words. Adiz sat at her desk long after office hours ended, staring at her screen, realizing that trust does not shatter loudly, it dissolves. The humor of it all struck her briefly, sharp and bitter. She had built a life stable enough to hide betrayal inside it without tremors. That irony stayed with her, not as pain, but as instruction. By the time she shut down her computer and picked up her bag, the emotional storm most people expected had already passed. What remained was resolve. Adiz did not rehearse accusations. She did not plan speeches. She did not imagine revenge. Her mind returned to structure, to order, to rules previously agreed upon. Some people respond to betrayal with chaos. Adiz responded with enforcement. If love was broken, the agreement remained intact. And agreements, unlike feelings, do not require discussion when violated. The confrontation unfolded like a business meeting neither party had scheduled, but one had prepared for. Adiz waited until the house was quiet, until the evening settled into its familiar stillness. Nelson spoke casually, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. When she finally spoke, her voice did not tremble. It did not accuse. It stated facts, one by one, calmly, with the precision that had built her career and funded his comfort. Nelson laughed first, then denied, then minimized. His reactions followed a predictable pattern, almost textbook, and Adiz watched him with the detached curiosity of someone observing a process she already understood. She placed the evidence before him, not dramatically, not angrily. Receipts, records, timelines. Each document closed a door he attempted to open with excuses. When denial collapsed, he reached for justification. Stress, temptation, loneliness, unemployment, as though hardship were permission, as though her labor had not cushioned him through every excuse he now presented. Adiz listened without interruption, not because she believed him, but because silence often reveals more than argument. And Nelson revealed everything, his entitlement, his fear, his assumption that forgiveness was automatic. When he finished, Adiz reminded him of the prenup. She did not shout the clause. She did not weaponize it. She recited it the way one recites a policy already known to both parties. Cheating meant leaving. Immediately. No negotiations. No delays. Nelson scoffed, calling it unfair, calling it cold, calling it something they could talk about later. That was when Adiz stood, not aggressively, not dramatically, but definitively. Some endings do not announce themselves. They simply conclude. And in that quiet living room, without witnesses or raised voices, Nelson's place in her life ended completely. Nelson did not leave when Adiz asked him to. He sat instead, first on the arm of the sofa, then deeper into it, as though the furniture itself might grant him tenure. There was something almost absurd in the way he occupied space, like a man trying to prove ownership by proximity. He spoke in circles, asking for time, for understanding, for space to process everything. He reminded her of memories of shared laughter, of sacrifices she had made, as if those sacrifices were bargaining chips he could now cash in to delay consequences. His voice grew louder not from anger, but from fear, the kind that knows it is cornered, yet still hopes the walls will move if pushed hard enough. As minutes passed, Nelson's resistance changed shape. When pleading failed, entitlement took over. He spoke about the house as though contribution were implied by presence. He claimed partnership where there had only been consumption. He insisted she was being dramatic, accused her of cruelty, suggested counseling, prayer, time apart, anything that did not involve him leaving immediately. There was an unintentional dark humor in his desperation, the way every solution he proposed still required him to remain comfortable. Adiz listened without correcting him, realizing that men who have lived too long on borrowed stability often confuse generosity with obligation. He had mistaken her patience for permanence. Adiz finally spoke again, and the room seemed to shrink around her words. She told him, calmly and without threat in her tone, that refusal was not an option, that the agreement he signed did not include negotiation clauses, that staying past this moment would not be interpreted as courage, but as trespass. She explained, slowly, clearly, that she would take steps to have him removed if he delayed further. No raised voice. No shaking hands. Just certainty. Something broke in Nelson then, not loudly, but completely. He stood, suddenly aware that the ground beneath him no longer belonged to him. Within the hour, fear overcame pride. He grabbed what he could carry and left, not as a man exiting a marriage, but as someone fleeing a reality he could no longer manipulate. Night settled over the house like a held breath. The rooms Nelson had once moved through confidently now felt unfamiliar to him, as though the walls had quietly switched allegiance. Adiz did not follow him as he paced. She did not monitor his movements or count the minutes it took him to realize the truth. She returned to her seat not because she was weak, but because the decision had already been executed in her mind. Nelson, however, lingered in denial, opening drawers he had never organized, touching items he had never paid for, trying to anchor himself to a space that no longer recognized him. The silence pressed on him harder than shouting ever could. In that silence, he finally understood that this was not an argument, it was removal. Fear works faster than pride when reality becomes unavoidable. Nelson's thoughts raced ahead of his hands. He imagined witnesses. He imagined police reports. He imagined explaining himself to people who would not care about his excuses. The house, once a shelter, now felt like evidence. Every object around him reminded him of what he had lost access to, not because Adiz was cruel, but because he had violated the one rule that mattered. The humor of it struck him bitterly. He had lived comfortably for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be unsafe. Now, safety had been revoked. Consequences, patient and punctual, had arrived exactly on time. When he finally stepped out into the night, it was not with dignity, but with urgency. He did not look back. He did not announce his departure. He disappeared the way men often do when accountability becomes heavier than ego. By morning, his phone was unreachable. By afternoon, his name stopped answering questions. Adiz did not block him immediately, not out of hope, but out of indifference. Silence, she knew, was not absence. It was closure in progress. Morning arrived without ceremony. The house woke the way it always had, quiet, orderly, indifferent to human drama. Adiz moved through her routine with deliberate normalcy. Coffee brewed. Emails were checked. Schedules were reviewed. There was no rush to inform anyone of what had happened because nothing had happened in the way people expected. No shouting. No police. No scandal. Just subtraction. And subtraction, Adiz realized, was sometimes the cleanest form of change. The absence Nelson left behind was not painful. It was spacious. It made room for clarity. Calls began to come in later, subtle at first, then curious. Friends who had not heard from Nelson. Relatives asking vague questions. Adiz answered calmly, briefly, without embellishment. She did not explain herself because explanations invite debate. She stated facts and moved on. There was a quiet satisfaction in realizing that she did not owe anyone a version of events that protected Nelson's pride. The prenup had done its work. The boundary had been enforced. Anything else was noise. By evening, the truth settled fully. Nelson was gone, and not just from the house. His presence in her life had been erased the way one erases a mistaken entry from a record, firmly, without apology. Adiz sat alone that night, not grieving the man she lost, but acknowledging the strength it took to choose herself without spectacle. Some endings are loud and messy. This one was silent, controlled, and final. And in that silence, Adiz did not feel lonely. She felt free. They arrived at the decision the way people often do when panic dresses itself as courage. With swollen feet, restless nights, and promises that no longer answered calls, the two women convinced themselves that silence from Nelson did not mean abandonment. It meant strategy. In their minds, disappearance was not defeat, but delay. Surely he had gone ahead to settle things. Surely money was being rearranged, plans renegotiated, space being created for them. They leaned into the comfort of shared belief, feeding each other reassurance, the way frightened people do when reality grows too sharp. After all, they reasoned, a man who enjoyed such a lifestyle could not simply vanish without a safety net. Someone, somewhere, was still paying. Their conversations circled endlessly around entitlement. They were pregnant. Twice over. That fact alone felt like authority. They rehearsed what they would say, how they would stand, how the truth of their condition would silence opposition. One of them joked darkly that a pregnant woman was society's unspoken shield. The other laughed, but nervously. Underneath the bravado was fear neither wanted to name. Bills were waiting. Bodies were changing. And the man who had promised everything had become unreachable. What they needed now was confirmation, not from Nelson, but from the source. If his wife was the foundation of his comfort, then surely she would be forced to listen. By the time they set their plan in motion, dignity had already been traded for desperation. They did not consider how strange it was that Nelson had not warned them. They did not question why he had not accompanied them. They chose instead to believe that confrontation would restore order. If they showed up visibly pregnant, visibly united, visibly unafraid, the truth would rearrange itself in their favor. Confidence, after all, is easiest to borrow when consequences have not yet arrived. And so, armed with certainty that did not belong to them, they headed toward Adi's place of work, unaware that the man they came to defend no longer had a place in her life, or anywhere else that mattered. Adi's office was not a place accustomed to chaos. It ran on quiet efficiency, measured conversations, and unspoken respect. Glass walls held professionalism in place, and voices rarely rose above necessity. That was why the disruption felt so sharp when it came. Security hesitated first, confused by the urgency, unsettled by the sight of two pregnant women demanding audience with someone they insisted on calling their husband's wife. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. Heads lifted. Conversations paused. Adi's was in a meeting when the interruption arrived, and the room seemed to inhale as her name was spoken with urgency it had never carried before. They did not wait for permission once they saw her. The announcement came raw and loud, spilling into shared space where privacy did not exist. Words like pregnant, promised, responsibility landed without mercy, each syllable designed to wound, to shock, to force reaction. Employees froze, not out of curiosity, but discomfort. This was not gossip, this was collision. The two women stood together, visibly swollen, visibly resolute, mistaking attention for power. They expected tears. They expected denial. They expected the unraveling of a woman they had never met, but already resented. What they did not expect was stillness. Adi's did not raise her voice. She did not retreat. She did not perform the role they had written for her. For a moment, just a moment, shock crossed her face, not because of Nelson, but because of scale. Two pregnancies. Two strangers. One man who had already fled. The room waited. And then, calmly, professionally, Adi's did something that shifted everything. She asked them to follow her. Not angrily. Not urgently. Simply firmly. As she turned toward the conference room, authority returned to its rightful owner. The public stage they had chosen closed behind them, and the real reckoning, quiet, controlled, irreversible, was about to begin. The shock that moved through Adi's body in that moment was not loud, but it was profound. It was the kind of shock that rearranged reality in seconds, forcing the mind to catch up with information it never planned to receive. Two women. Two pregnancies. One husband who had already vanished. For a brief heartbeat, Adi's felt the weight of it, not as humiliation, but as disbelief. Not because Nelson had cheated, that wound had already closed, but because the scale of his recklessness revealed itself fully for the first time. This was not betrayal. This was collapse. And collapse, she realized, had a way of sending debris flying in every direction. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The glass walls muted the outside world, turning whispers into distant echoes. The two women stood expectantly, still armed with confidence, still rehearsing outrage. They spoke quickly, overlapping, reinforcing each other's claims. Nelson had promised them support. Nelson had assured them everything was handled. Nelson had said his wife would understand. The repetition of his name sounded almost ceremonial, as though invoking him might summon money, authority, or protection back into the room. Adi's listened without interruption, her face unreadable. There was something unsettling in her calm, a stillness that did not invite argument or sympathy. When they finished, Adi spoke, slowly, carefully, without cruelty. She told them Nelson no longer lived with her, that he had been sent away days earlier, that he had no access to her finances, her home, or her life. The words landed unevenly, sinking first, then spreading. The women stared at her, confused, then alarmed. One laughed nervously, assuming this was a tactic. The other asked where he was. Adiz answered truthfully. She did not know, and she did not care to find out. In that moment, the trap the women had so carefully built collapsed inward. Pregnancy had not secured a future. It had exposed a void. The silence that followed was heavy, not because Adiz had won, but because the reality they now faced had no one left to lean on. Power does not always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like clarity that leaves no room for negotiation. Adiz watched the realization spread across their faces, the slow understanding that Nelson was not hiding wealth, not planning reconciliation, not orchestrating anything at all. He was gone. The man they had trusted, plotted with, and risked their bodies for had evaporated the moment accountability arrived. Adiz did not mock them. She did not raise her voice. She understood something they did not yet have the strength to admit. Regret was already on its way. Her task was not punishment. It was protection. She stood and walked to the door of the conference room, closing it gently, deliberately. Then she returned to her seat and told them exactly what would happen next. They would leave her office immediately. They would not return. They would not contact her again. They would not speak her name in public or private spaces. She explained calmly that harassment, intentional or emotional, would be treated as such. There was no threat in her voice, only certainty. The kind that does not need reinforcement. The women protested weakly at first, clinging to the last fragments of entitlement. Adiz listened, then ended the discussion. She asked them to swear it. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply to say the words aloud and mean them. There was hesitation, then fear, then compliance. They swore. In that moment, something shifted permanently. Adiz was no longer their adversary. She was the boundary they could not cross. She escorted them out with professionalism intact, her posture unbroken, her reputation untouched. Outside the glass walls, work resumed. Phones rang. Meetings continued. Life did not pause for their miscalculation. When Adiz returned to her office, she closed the door and sat quietly for a moment, not exhausted, not shaken, but resolved. Nelson was gone. His mess had been contained. The women who came seeking leverage had left with reality instead. And the most unsettling part of it all was how little noise it took. Some endings do not need witnesses. They only need finality. Nelson did not vanish dramatically. There were no farewell messages, no public sightings, no grand exit worthy of the chaos he left behind. He simply slipped out of relevance, the way men do when the world stops accommodating their excuses. His phone rang unanswered. Messages stayed unread. Mutual friends who once praised his resilience now spoke carefully, if at all. When people asked about him, answers grew vague. Someone said he traveled. Someone else said he was figuring things out. The truth was less poetic. Nelson had nowhere solid to stand. Without Adiz's home, money, or protection, his life lost structure. He became a man moving through days without anchors, relying on borrowed couches, borrowed stories, borrowed time. Rumors moved quietly, never settling long enough to become facts. Some said he avoided familiar places out of fear of questions he couldn't answer. Others said shame followed him like a shadow, making every social interaction feel like an interrogation. What remained consistent was absence. He no longer appeared in conversations about success, plans, or potential. He had become a cautionary reference instead of a person. Remember Nelson, a sentence that ended without enthusiasm. The irony was almost cruel. The man who once enjoyed visibility, funded by another woman's labor, now struggled to exist without being noticed at all. Adiz heard fragments of these stories without seeking them. She did not ask where Nelson was. She did not track his movements or investigate his survival. Disappearance, she understood, was not her problem to solve. If consequences had scattered him, that was the natural order correcting itself. She focused instead on restoring equilibrium in her own life. Some people chase closure. Adiz practiced attachment. And detachment, she discovered, was far more effective. Life after disruption often feels strangely ordinary. That was what surprised Adiz the most. There was no lingering chaos, no emotional hangover demanding constant attention. Her days resumed their rhythm, but lighter. Meetings felt sharper. Decisions felt clearer. Even silence felt different, less like emptiness and more like space. She realized that much of the fatigue she once attributed to work had come from carrying a man who refused to carry himself. The humor of it struck her occasionally. Uninvited and dry, she had mistaken endurance for partnership. At work, nothing changed publicly, and everything changed privately. Colleagues treated her with the same respect, but with a subtle shift she recognized immediately. Not pity, not curiosity, admiration. People noticed how she handled disruption without spectacle, how the office absorbed the shock and continued functioning, how her authority remained intact. In environments that valued control, her composure became its own quiet story. No gossip stuck because there was nothing dramatic to repeat. Adiz had denied scandal its oxygen. In the evenings, she returned to a home that finally felt proportionate to her effort. No tension waiting in corners. No unspoken negotiations. Just stillness that belonged to her. She did not celebrate the end of her marriage. She acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges the end of a difficult chapter without rereading it. Nelson's absence no longer felt like loss. It felt like correction. And as days passed, one truth settled firmly. She had not destroyed a family. She had enforced a boundary. Everything that fell apart had been standing on her tolerance alone. The aftermath did not announce itself with drama for the two women who once stood united in defiance. Reality arrived gradually, settling into their lives the way dust settles after a collapse, slow, unavoidable, and revealing. Without Nelson, without access to the lifestyle they had built their hopes around, they were forced to confront the cost of the choice they had made together. Friendship, once their shield, began to strain under pressure. Pregnancy has a way of demanding honesty, and honesty is rarely kind to alliances built on desperation. Conversations that once sounded confident now carried blame disguised as concern. Each wondered privately if the other had pushed too hard, hoped too much, trusted too blindly. Support networks thinned quickly. Sympathy, they discovered, had limits when paired with intent. People listened, nodded, then quietly stepped back. Promises made by a man who no longer existed in their lives could not be redeemed. Plans unraveled. Living arrangements shifted. Medical appointments replaced fantasies. They learned painfully that leverage only works when someone is still holding the rope. Nelson had let go long ago, and the wife they had tried to confront had not only refused to be pulled into their chaos, she had sealed the door behind them with precision. What lingered most was the understanding they had not anticipated. They had misjudged the wrong woman. Adiz had not been weak. She had been generous. She had not been blind. She had been trusting. And trust, once violated, did not negotiate, it concluded. The oath they swore in that conference room stayed with them, heavy and instructive. They did not return. They did not call. They did not test boundaries. Some lessons, once learned, demand obedience. And in their quieter moments, stripped of bravado, they understood that pregnancy had not trapped a man. It had trapped them in the consequences of believing entitlement could replace integrity. Adiz did not rebuild her life with announcements or ceremonies. There were no declarations of independence, no public statements reclaiming strength. She simply continued, steadily, deliberately, into a life no longer weighted by compromise. Mornings felt lighter. Decisions arrived without resistance. The absence of chaos did not feel empty. It felt earned. She learned that peace was not something granted after forgiveness. It was something claimed through boundaries. And boundaries, once enforced, did not require explanation. People around her noticed the shift even when they could not name it. She walked differently, spoke differently, not louder, clearer. Her success no longer carried the invisible burden of supporting someone who resented her for it. She invested in herself without guilt, rested without apology, and trusted her instincts without second-guessing them. The humor of hindsight surfaced occasionally, gentle and dry. She had once feared losing a marriage that was sustained almost entirely by her effort. Now she wondered how she had carried that imbalance for so long without recognizing the cost. Nelson remained absent, not as a mystery, but as a closed chapter. The two women faded into memory, not as enemies, but as evidence. Adiz did not chase revenge because life had already done the accounting. She had not raised her voice. She had not begged, fought, or performed grief for an audience. She had simply enforced the truth and walked forward. And that was the quiet power of her victory. No noise, no spectacle, just finality. Some stories end with applause. This one ended with silence. And in that silence, Adiz stood whole. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.